Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to be talking about environmental quality of calf housing types in the UK, looking at a couple examples there, and Al's going to share his thoughts with us. Before we get going, though, I want to remind those of you that are tuning in, I want to thank you first for tuning in. And then if you have any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat area to the right of your screen. If you're joining us from social media, simply post those questions directly in your channel there. A side note, we're coming to you from the National Pork Industry Forum here in Chicago. So we're going to be talking dairy from a pork show, Al. But we are by O'Hare Airport. So if you happen to hear some airplanes going over, don't worry, no panic. Dr. Kurtz, great to have you with us. I'm going to turn it over to you. And why don't you walk us through what you're thinking here today?
Okay, we're going to talk about the environment, not in terms of spring break, although that's on the minds of some people. In this case, we're talking about a very different environment than in the US, and that's the United Kingdom. And calves are really subjected to a variety of types of housing and ambient temperature and humidity. And one of the areas we categorize that with is what's called a zone of thermal neutrality. And that means that for every animal species, there's a zone in which they don't have to expend energy to stay warm or to cool down. So that's why it's called the zone of thermal neutrality. And for calves, the most recent one, NESEM 2021 document, it says it's 59 to 79 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 to 26 centigrade. So in the article, I put both centigrade and Fahrenheit for those that are mostly on centigrade. You can relate to it more easily, and those on Fahrenheit. I'll talk about the Fahrenheit and numbers. So that's what I'm most familiar with. So if you remember last year, I reported on two different studies about heat stress in calves. One, which was a major study from California and Florida, and found that in Florida, with the humidity being much higher, the heat stress was worse, whereas in California, lower humidity is not as bad. And then the other one was from Wisconsin, and that was during the summertime. And even though we don't think of it many times that way, but going above 79 degrees Fahrenheit is not unusual. So there can be a heat stress in that. But in the UK, it has a temperate climate. So that typically means that they have cooler, wetter winters and warmer, wet summers, with the mean winter and summer temperatures in 2021 of about 33 Fahrenheit and 60 degrees Fahrenheit for winter and summer. And of course, there are ranges in those temperatures, about 30 degrees or so, up to 50 in the summertime. So even in the upper temperature range in the UK, there is some outside the zone of thermal neutrality. And so there would be some heat stress. And in the wintertime, of course, there's a number of temperatures that are below the zone of thermal neutrality. So there would be need for additional energy expended to stay warm. So in the US and the northern climates, of course, we have more cold stress in the wintertime, but still, as I said in one study in Wisconsin, there is some heat stress during the summertime as well. Now, housing affects calves' environment on various ways. One is the stocking density, degree of insulation of the housing from the climate, the bedding, the type of it, and the ventilation. And I reviewed a study in 2019 that was done in Wisconsin, and they actually looked closely at ventilation and found that in general, you want to have about 4 air exchanges per hour. So you don't want really high exchanges unless the temperature is hotter, maybe. But even then, it doesn't necessarily have a beneficial effect to have a very high rate. I was once on a large dairy operation in Thailand, and they had a flow-through system like we see with cow housing. And actually, there was almost too much wind, and they had to cut it back down because the calves were somewhat being stressed by the degree of the wind. And then the other thing that happens is if you don't have adequate air exchange and you have higher humidity, bacteria grow more. So you have more chance of having bacterial issues. And the other thing that was interesting in this study in Wisconsin, the wintertime interior housing, was that the average of moisture content of the bedding was about 50%. That is astonishing. And there's an old trick called the wet knee test. You can kneel down, and if your knee gets wet, there's too much moisture in the bedding, need to add more. So when it's that wet, then the calves lose more heat because it's directly conducted through the wetness. So that's another factor to consider. So in this study, they looked at 9 different dairy farms in the southern part of England. They had they did June and July in 2021 for summer, and they did March, let's see, January to March 2022 for winter conditions. And you can look at the examples and the details in the article, but there were different types of housing, and we'll break that out further. One of them, I didn't understand what it was at first until I looked more closely at it. They called it polytunnel. It's what we would call a greenhouse. And some of you may remember when greenhouses in the northern climate, particularly in the upper Midwest, really took off for calf housing. But what happened was after several years, there was not a good, evidently, exchange of bedding. And so some of the pathogens built up in the soil and they didn't work as well. So they eventually went away. You don't see many of those anymore. But there was one of those in this study. And then, of course, they had different kinds of bedding, different feeding programs. Uh, a number of them, 2 farms actually had straw in a rack for eating besides what they call the concentrate, and didn't tell what farm that was. And then generally they fed straight milk, not milk replacer, 3 or 4 liters per farm twice a day. So that was their feeding program. Um, and then, of course, there's some details about how often did they clean out the stalls where the calves were. In some cases, they just continued to add housing on top or bedding on top, and so you'd have that stockpiled over time. And then, of course, how many times a day did they check out the bedding and that sort of thing. So if we look at some of those bullet points, the hutches were placed outside and used on 4 farms. And then there was one greenhouse, and then there were a couple with inside pens. The remaining 5 farms housed calves in a shed with either gates to separate the calves or solid walls. At the initial visit, they took multiple measurements to describe the physical properties, and we'll look at that in a minute. And then there were no formal measures of calf health made during the visits. So we don't have any health dimensions there. Now, if we look at the table, there were no significant difference between the mechanically ventilated farms or housing, that's 3 of them, and non-ventilated, which was 2 of those, for temperature or the THI, temperature humidity index, and so on. So they acknowledge, though, that the mechanical ventilation may not have been optimized, and that was beyond their expertise. That's really something that generally isn't paid too much attention to. All of the 3 ventilated housing units at positive pressure. That means they were pushing air out from the inside of the building. And that's a key part of a good ventilation system interior, because Ken Nordland, when he was at the University of Wisconsin Vet School, and some of the others there did some studies, and he developed a process how you can do that and how beneficial that is. You can go search on Google and you can find that. I even found somebody in China that was using that about 10 years ago, his website to help them do the ventilation. Now, if we look at the actual numbers in table 1, we see that in terms of the temperature, uh, in the wintertime, external temperature was 44 degrees Fahrenheit. When they were in the shed, it was 47. And then in the hutch, 45. And then the tunnel, 47. So not much temperature difference inside the various types of housing compared to the outside temperature. In the summertime, it was 63 across, 64, 66. So again, not much difference. But, they have more moderate winter temperature, more moderate summer temperatures. So that's not too surprising. But the humidity is fairly high in the United Kingdom. So you see in the wintertime, it's in the 80s, one of them down to 74. And then in the summertime, it drops a little bit to the upper 70s. So it's a fairly high humidity. So as a result, when you calculate the temperature humidity index, even though the temperature may not be as high, high humidity elevates that number. So if you look at the THI, in the wintertime, it was in the low 40s, mid to low 40s. And so that is outside the zone of thermal neutrality. So in the wintertime, the calves need more energy to keep warm. However, in the summertime, they also had some issues because anything over 70 could be a problem. Now, the average was 60, but during the daytime, if you do that on a 24-hour cycle, it may be above 70. But there's more of an issue during the wintertime being colder for the calves than in the summertime in the UK. And of course, they measure light as well. And we know that there's some cloudy days in London. And so we expect that there could be some difference. In the wintertime, you see that the light in terms of the measure is much less than in the summertime in the external, 20,000 units versus 66,000. And if you look at the individual housing, there's also a spread, more so with the shed being darker than outside, although the hutch is about 1/4 of the light inside versus outside, and then that greenhouse as well. They measured low, as you can see, especially in the wintertime, not a little bit higher, no, actually a little lower, external, outside. So that wasn't much a factor. Now, in terms of bacteria, the external, they didn't have a measure of it. But in internal, in the shed, you see that in the wintertime, the bacteria counts were lower than during the summertime, 8,100 versus 19,100. And the same thing for the hutch, lower in the winter than in the summer. And then the tunnel, the same thing. The reason for that is because, of course, bacteria multiply more rapidly when there's a warmer temperature. So that's why the summertime bacteria loads would have been heavier. They had a couple measures of particle size, or what do they call it? Particulate matter that's in the air. So that could be from dust or the bedding and that sort of thing. So if we look at those numbers, we see that in the wintertime, the particulate matter was higher for the sheds than in summertime, either measure. And it was the highest across the board compared to the hutch, which had lower numbers than the sheds, and also the particulate matter was higher in the winter than in summer. And then in the one tunnel or greenhouse, it was closer to being the same, but fairly low. So again, the particulate matter and the bacteria load can be factors that affect the calves, particularly respiratory incidents, and as you might imagine. So that's kind of a summation of the results that they found. Now, uh, the authors also had some comments. So they noted that with the hutches, calves had both an internal and external environment, which could impact calves, because most of the times with a hutch, there's an outside area, usually enclosed, where the calf can go outside for a little bit of exercise or some sunlight, or out of the hutch. So that's a kind of a dual phase program, and that could have a more of an effect on calves. And the types of hutches can also vary considerably. And just in terms of disclosure, I have worked with a major manufacturer of calf hutches, um, just so that you're aware of that. And so I have some familiarity with hutches and their placement and management in various dairy farms around the U.S. and other countries as well. So that's kind of a summation of the study and the results.
Very good. A reminder to post any questions that you might have for Dr. Kurtz there in the chat. And I believe, yes, we have posted the link to Dr. Kurtz's column, so you can check that out. You also can find that on feedstuffs.com and in the March edition of Feedstuffs, which will be coming out here in a few weeks. So, Dr. Kurtz, this is research that is out of the UK. But you seem to feel there's a lot of learnings that we can have here in the US just from taking a look at the different environmental conditions and different housing conditions. Is that what you're kind of how you're seeing that?
Yes, because they made some measurements that I haven't seen in studies published from the US, except for those that I mentioned earlier about the heat stress. So they have some good measurements of various environmental factors: temperature, humidity, um, the type of housing, the temperature humidity index, the airspeed, the light, bacterial load, particulate matter. Those are good measures to have, but I haven't seen them many places. And that's why I chose this study, because it had that information. And even though they have a different environment we have here, you can see how the environment may affect those numbers, or maybe it doesn't have a big effect. So with their higher humidity and higher temperature during the summer, they may have more bacterial load than certainly in the US, in the western part of the US, where we have higher temperatures in the summer, but we don't have high humidity. So that keeps the bacterial load down. So these are some of the factors that should be considered when you're looking at types of calf housing and the pluses and minuses.
So kind of things we can't duplicate here. It's good to look at them somewhere else and to learn from those.
Yeah.
So what would you say then is your bottom line in all of this? What do you want folks to remember from this work?
Remember the factors that are pretty significant. One is the temperature. The second one is the humidity, and they interact. So the higher the temperature humidity index, which generally occurs in more humid summertime conditions, the more that's going to affect the calves, because they're going to be outside the zone of thermal neutrality. And in wintertime, you can also have a fair amount of humidity and a really low temperature, like in the northern part of the US and the Northeast, and that's going to put the calves below the zone of thermal neutrality. So your housing can also have a beneficial effect. If you've got calves in hutches or even inside in the wintertime, you generally want to use loose straw, because it captures air pockets and that provides insulation. And if you notice calves in the wintertime in that kind of environment, what they'll do is they'll kind of hunker down as much as possible, even put their legs, front legs, underneath the straw to keep it as warm as possible. So that's why the type of bedding in the wintertime is important, and straws generally used for that. In the summertime, when you might have some heat stress, then a lot of places will go to sand bedding because you don't have those air pockets trapped. You've got a more open area, and the sand tends to stay cooler as long as it's not in the sunlight. So those are a number of the factors that you should consider when you're looking at your housing, or if you're looking at changing your housing.
Very good. A reminder too, if you'd like to check out Al's column, it is there in the chat. So thank you so much, Dr. Kurtz, for joining us today and sharing this with us.
You're welcome. Be back next
And
time.
you gotcha. We'll see you next month. So we appreciate all of you joining us as well. A reminder that you can view this interview as well as other ones we've done with Dr. Kurtz and other experts in the field at Feedstuffs 365. Just go to feedstuffs.com and click on Feedstuffs 365. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.